A couple of weeks ago, I published an episode on the Northern Cod and Capelin. I said Capelin during that episode, but it's Capelin, uh, where we talked about the fishery stocks and how, the fishery stocks are not doing well. They're stalling in growth, and there's needs and meetings to make sure that we take a cautionary approach and put things together. I was very happy to receive an email from Rebecca Schijns from Oceana Canada saying, hey, I was at the meetings. I was at those meetings that you're talking about in this episode. And I'm very happy that you had Capelin involved in your story. And I would love to come on the show to be able to talk more about those meetings and give you more details about what's needed for the fishery to do better, to get from that critical zone or even cautionary zone to the healthy zone, which is what we all want. And so she came on the episode. I invited her back on to talk more about Northern Cod stocks as well as Capelin stocks, and to be able to look at the future and what a call to action to what we can do as citizens, or even just people of the ocean, people around the world, how we can influence the decision in a little bit in our way. So we're going to talk about all of that on this episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. Let's start the show. Hey, everybody, welcome back to another exciting episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Lewin. This is the podcast where you find out what's happening with the ocean, how you can speak up for the ocean, and what you can do to live for a better ocean by taking action. And on today's episode, we have a special one for you. We have Rebecca Schijns, who is a marine scientist at Oceana Canada. She is here to discuss two fishery stocks that are related. We're talking about the Northern Cod stocks. We're talking about the Capelin stocks in Newfoundland area. She was at meetings with DFO Science, as well as, which is Department of Fisheries and Ocean Science, as well as other academic sort of stakeholders, as well as Indigenous stakeholders, as well as industry stakeholders, fisheries industry stakeholders, to go to a couple of meetings to be able to take part in how all of these decisions are made and how the science is put together and the consensus report is done. So we're going to hear all about that and what is needed, what tools are in place right now, and how they actually need to be implemented faster. They've been in place since 2019, but they haven't actually been implemented since then. It's 2024 already. So 5 years later, we still haven't had it, but we have some hope that they're going to be implemented soon. And they're starting that implementation to come up with management plans for one of the most infamous stocks, the Northern Cod stocks, that has made worldwide news for the past 30 years in its demise, as well as its struggle for recovery. And so there's an opportunity here, as Rebecca mentions, there's an opportunity here to say, hey, we could actually do some good work and some great things, and we can actually recover this fishery. And then it could be a great example for the rest of the world, not just from the collapse, but also the recovery. So we're going to talk all about that on today's episode. So here is Rebecca Schijns from Oceana Canada talking about the Northern Cod stocks as well as the Capelin stocks. Enjoy the interview, and I will talk to you after. Hey, Rebecca, welcome back to the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. Are you ready to talk about fisheries in Canada?
I am always ready to talk about fisheries in Canada. Thank you for having me.
You bet. It's having you back because you were on December 22nd. We published the episode where we talked about the fisheries audit that Oceana Canada does and sort of where we're at in Canadian fisheries, the stock assessments, where information was lacking, some hope, some sort of despair, and like where we need to really improve, which was really great information. And I did an episode a couple of Mondays ago on Northern Cod that I found an article on the CBC website. And I did an episode. You listened to it, which thank you very much for that. And you were like, hey, Andrew, I've got some more information. I was actually in the room at the meeting. Do you want me to come on and shed some light on what happened and sort of give some more information? And I was like, absolutely. This is a great opportunity to find out what happens in those meetings for everybody else, right? Who were not in those meetings, and just to get some context other than just a summary, like an article that CBC would get, which was good information, but it's just nice to know all the details. I like to know all the details anyway. So before we get into all that though, Rebecca, why don't you just remind our audience of who you are and what you do?
Thanks. My name is Rebecca Schijns, and I'm a fisheries scientist with Oceana Canada. And Oceana Canada is a science-based conservation organization focused on tackling the ocean's biggest threats and strengthening policies to rebuild abundance in our oceans.
Awesome. Fantastic. And it's an interesting role. Did you, I think we talked a little bit about this last time. Did you ever expect to do this role when you first started your journey in marine science?
I don't think I ever fully realized what a career in marine science would look like. I think it's about kind of taking those opportunities to spend more time with people that spend time on the ocean, with it, jump in the ocean, go diving, interact at the docks, and see where things lead you. And then, of course, I had a thirst for knowledge and carried on in my bachelor's and my master's, focusing more and more on marine science.
I think that's great. I think what you just summarized just at the beginning, being like, I don't really know, I didn't think I knew what a marine science career looked like. I think that's a lot of us, including myself when I first started. Even when I got out of my master's, I'm like, where do I go now? What do I do now? I'm glad you were able to find Oceana Canada. I'm glad you're able that you are in now, which is, it's a terrific role, providing information to Canadians about fishery stocks. It's super important because we have a long history of sort of management of fishery stocks, some mismanagement, some good management. And as you mentioned, in the fisheries audit last time, there's a lot of room for improvement. And we need people to continue with that, pressure and working ability with the government to ensure that we have those types of sort of people in that role to be able to kind of give them that information and provide that information. So that's always great to hear. But now we're going to be talking about Northern Cod and Capelin. Pronounced it properly, right?
You did.
Is it? I did. Okay. Because before I was saying Capelin, it's Capelin. And I'm glad you told me it's the right one. But we're going to talk about Northern Cod because that's the sort of infamous fishery that kind of made news worldwide in the early 90s. Northern cod was such an important species to Canadian fisheries history. And it still continues to be a sort of a cautionary tale of what not to do when you manage fisheries and ignoring science, ignoring fishery stock assessments and what needs to go into a proper fishery stock. Can you kind of just give us a little bit of an update or I guess maybe just a brief history, just so that I make sure I have my information right, of just sort of the history of like the Northern cod stock right before the moratorium, and then just sort of what's happened since, and briefly, you don't have to go into all the details, but just briefly.
Yeah, I could go as detailed as you would ever want, because it's an over 500-year-long fishery in Atlantic Canada. Yeah. It's one of the most integral parts of our coastal history. And there were fisheries operating and fishing cod sustainably for centuries. And in the 50s and the 60s, the fleet had a mass industrialization, and many, many countries were fishing in Canadian waters. This is before we had our boundaries formalized as jurisdiction on the water. And there was a lot of overfishing. There was a lot of bycatch, discarding, and ultimately the fish stocks collapsed in Atlantic Canada, and the boundaries were drawn. And then the Canadian fisheries fleet, instead of really taking the time to reassess the level of fishing that was happening, ramped up our own domestic efforts and led to an even further collapse of cod and many other ground fish, which have failed to recover since, nearly 30 years later. And so, this stock, specifically Northern cod, has a wealth of information, a very deep documented history, and it's now resulted in one of the most data-rich stocks in the world. And there's been an updated model to include even more information. And so that occurred in the fall, this new model, which included a juvenile surveys that have been done, Capelin surveys that have been done, which are cod's key prey, and they extended the time series to start in 1954, whereas previously the stock assessment had started in 1983. And so that discounts a large majority of the fishing history in the model that fisheries managers are using. So all of those additions to the model were good additions.
So the more information, the better, right? In these models?
Exactly. And for the first time ever, the addition of Capelin stock dynamics feeding into the cod model is an example of having an ecosystem component.
Now, let's talk a little bit about Capelin, because Northern Cod and Capelin are fairly tied together in terms of their stocks. Northern Cod feed on Capelin, so it's an important part of their recovery. And the fact is, Capelin is just as much in trouble, if not more, than the Northern Cod stock. So can we just kind of give a bit of it? Is the history very similar in terms of when the Capelin stocks kind of went down as well as the Northern Cod stock?
Yeah, Capelin were also overfished in the 90s. And unlike cod, there wasn't a moratorium on the fishing activity. So there still remains a fishing effort on that Capelin stock. There's also fishing on cod. It's not commercially recognized. There's a food fishery and recreational activity, and a stewardship fishery to gain scientific data and also to support the Newfoundland economy.
Okay, so I was aware of the stewardship fishery. That was I think it's with WWF, right? Is strongly involved in that. Is that correct? Or there was a pilot study that may have been a number of years ago, I thought. But is there somebody else involved in that?
The fishing industry in Newfoundland engages in the stewardship fishery, the inshore fleet.
Oh, okay. Okay. Now, I didn't realize there was still a fishery for, sort of food and recreational. How is that managed?
So currently it's not really regulated. There's, a limit on how many cod you can keep, but there isn't really a monitoring system in place. So there isn't a license requirement or a requirement to fill in something like a logbook. And so for a long time, that has been an unreported catch, right? So something this new assessment accounted for this time was some uncertainty in the level of catches, which would include a baseline of what the recreational fishery is catching.
Do you find it ironic that they're not tracking this? Like, knowing how sensitive this stock is and how important this stock is to recover, do you find it a little weird that this isn't being reported or tracked in any kind of way, like the food and the recreational fishery?
Well, the fisheries monitoring policy that should be guiding the department's efforts on accounting for all sources of catches was available in 2019, and we have not seen it formally implemented in any fishery in Canada. So I actually can't say I'm very surprised. It's something we have been advocating very strongly for, the importance of understanding where our catches are coming from in a timely and dependable manner. And so the monitoring policy is a really good tool. And now there is some dedicated resources within the department to implement this policy, and a list of priority stocks that they're going to be working on for the next 5 years.
Oh, great. Okay. So that's helpful. So we know it's the implementation is coming, and so we'll see less variability, hopefully, and more factual information that's coming through, and be able to get a little bit more of an idea of what's happening to the cod stocks within that fishery, if that's going up, or the catch per unit effort, and so forth. So that's really good to hear. Okay. So in terms, like, from the fisheries audit, Northern Cod and Capelin, where did they really, sort of sit within a stock assessment, and in terms of an audit? Like, where were they a well-known fishery? Where there's a need for more improvement, better management? Where did they sit?
So Capelin fell into the uncertain category for a really long time because there wasn't the baseline information to conclude what stock status it would be in. We did our own assessments and found that it would solidly fall in the critical zone. Sure enough, the latest assessment had shown and confirmed that it's very close to the limit reference point, which is that threshold of serious harm occurring on the stock. Capelin and cod are very dependent on one another. Cod are dependent on having available prey, which is capelin.
Right.
And,
right.
Once those fisheries collapsed in the early 90s, they have yet to recover to the healthy zone. So they're both heavily depleted. Capelin are actually only 9% of their pre-collapse levels. And both stocks have not shown signs of significant recovery. There was a little bit of positive signs in 2010 to 2016, but since 2016, both of those stocks' growth has flatlined, and cod are now projected to decline once again into the critical zone.
Can you talk about the different zones? Because I mentioned it in my episode previous, and you've mentioned it here. There's the critical zone, there's a cautionary zone. Is there one above that? And can you just kind of give us sort of the levels and what they signify?
I wish I had more time to talk about that other zone, because that is the healthy zone. That's where we want to be.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Unfortunately, a lot of my efforts focus on the stocks that are in the critical and cautious zones, which are, concerning levels of that fish population. They're not at healthy levels, and the fisheries management, the harvests that have to go on those fisheries correspond to what zone they're in. So when a stock falls within the critical zone, that means fishing must be at the lowest possible level. In many cases, this means a moratorium. And when it's in the cautious zone, that means that, there's growth, there might be growth in the stock. There's at this case, we're seeing some decline back into the critical zone, but where management then needs to ensure that harvest levels are resulting in growth. So overfishing is not occurring.
This is always interesting. So we knew that the Northern Cod, I think the latest at the meeting that you're at, and we'll talk about that in just a second. The article said that Northern Cod, even though their growth has stalled, they're just above the critical, like they're in the lower part of the cautionary zone, but there's a good chance that, like with the variability, that they can fall back in the critical zone. And you mentioned that they're predicted, the population is predicted to decline probably back into the critical zone over the next few years. But there seem to have been, I think you mentioned earlier, there seem to have been new data added to the models, which popped them up to the cautionary zone. But sorry, I don't know about this thumbs up thing. That's not me that's doing that. That's just the video camera. But there's a time where like capelin are still in that critical zone. But I know at one point in the article, the Fisheries Union wanted to add more data to the model. They wanted the modelers to add more data. Is there more data like there was for the cod fishery? And how would you think that would affect would it affect it in the same kind of way, like pop it up into the cautionary zone?
So the capelin stock status is somewhat dependent on where we're seeing cod. So with the addition of that information in the cod assessment, that meant that there was a better understanding of the relationship between cod and capelin, and it resulted in the threshold of that relationship to actually be at a much lower level. And now we are evaluating cod and capelin as, above that limit reference point. But what hasn't changed is the amount of fish in the water. It's still a concerning amount. So there's just a better understanding of the relationship between those stocks, and if it's if there's enough capelin for cod to continue growing.
Okay. In terms of the models, a lot of people that are not within fishery science or not in science at all, they always talk, they tend to criticize models, as well as within fishery science. We criticize models because they're never really perfect. There are assumptions that are made and so forth. The more data you get, the better. As time goes on, the more people that are working at it, the better it gets and the more accurate it gets, but it never will be perfect. There's always some kind of variability. In your opinion, and the opinion for Oceana Canada, is how accurate are these models that are being run on these fishery stocks?
Yeah, so like you said, there's always assumptions and uncertainties. So it's whether you have confidence and evidence to make those assumptions. And for what we have seen with cod, one of the most data-rich stocks in the world, there's a lot of evidence to support the assumptions in that model. For example,
Right.
assuming that there's some unaccounted for fishing coming from the recreational fishery. So it assumes that there's around 2,000 tons coming from the recreational fishery added into the model. And so, assumptions like that, everything goes through a peer-reviewed process. And so there's a lot of experts in the room going through all of the inputs and outputs of those models. So when they are finally published, it's something that can inform a good science-based recommendation to fisheries managers.
Now, you mentioned in your email to me after you listened to the episode that you were in the meetings in Newfoundland, where Fisheries and Oceans Canada and the science group talked about these stocks. So what are the purpose of this meeting, and can you just kind of describe what happened at those?
Yeah, so there was a assessment meeting, like I mentioned, and there was kind of a briefing to media afterwards on some of the findings of the assessment and the stock status, the kind of latest stock status update. And so that was, like I said, a peer-reviewed meeting. So experts from the field, including myself and a lot of members of the department itself, went through the model, went through all of the science inputs, the survey information, and there were presentations, there were a lot of questions and discussions, and ultimately coming to a consensus. And then following the assessment, there is the advisory meeting. And that is where all the stakeholders, the fishing industry representatives, Indigenous representatives, and other environmental groups like myself are present. And we listen to the fisheries managers present and update us on their proposed measures for the season. And there's a discussion on, what is the best path forward. And there is usually not consensus in those meetings because everyone has their unique perspectives. And so,
of course,
we make recommendations for the fishing season ahead. And so, based on the update for cod being, right at that limit reference point, right in between the critical and cautious zone, projected to decline, there was a lot of discussion about whether the commercial fishery should be reopened for the first time in over 30 years, whether it should remain a stewardship fishery, but with an increased quota, whether you just stay the course, or if added precaution is needed and if harvest levels should decline, which is what we are recommending.
Okay, so almost like not opening up the fishery because we think that the fishery is going to decline just based on the data and the models that have shown, right?
Yeah, there's a lot more needed to bring this stock back to health. And right now we're seeing concerning signals. We got to take advantage of this opportunity here where there was some growth in 2010 to 2016. And there is really a time right now for the department to step up and take advantage of all of the amazing resources available, those ecosystem-based approaches, and rebuild to informed recovery targets.
Is there ever a scenario where the fishery would open while the fishery is still in the cautionary zone? Or would it have to be above into the healthy zone?
Well, the thing that is lacking for Northern Cod and Capelin is a very fulsome management plan. So defined targets as to where we consider these stocks recovered, where we would consider them healthy, and then have a discussion on the harvest control rules that will get us there. So there's still a lack of that long-term vision for rebuilding being grounded in a management plan. And up until the last assessment, the Northern Cod stock actually required a rebuilding plan by law. But since the new assessment places it just above the limit reference point, there's no longer a legal requirement to make a rebuilding plan. And so we're really faced with, we still really need these measures in place. there's a way to get there. There's good guidance. There's good examples of many rebuilding plans coming down the line very soon. And to keep the momentum there, there's already a working group established on this rebuilding plan. And so we don't want to see all of that hard work shelved. And
for sure,
we want a clear direction to where we can consider both of these stocks recovered.
Really surprises me that, you know, even if the stock goes above into the cautionary zone, once it's in the cautionary zone, there's no requirement for a management plan. You would almost think that every fishery, especially the one with the history of collapse, and even Capelin, which is very tied to it, and it's also had a steep decline since, you would think that that would be the first thing that, you know, DFO would do, or just sort of the managers would do, is come up with a management plan so we never ever have to be in this situation again, if that's a big if these cod stocks and capelin stocks ever get to the healthy zone. Like, you would think, even if it's in the cautionary zone where there's no requirement for it, you would think the cautionary approach, or the conservative approach, or the scientific approach would be an ecosystem-based management plan to just say, hey, let's just make sure we never get to this place, and let's not rush this stock, even though I know it's dependent on the economy, but let's make sure that this plan is in place, whether it's in the critical zone, whether it's in the cautionary zone, or even whether it's in the healthy zone. Does that not make sense? Is that what you guys are pushing for? Like, the sort of the environmental community, I'm sure probably the indigenous community as well?
Yeah, we think that having a plan has a lot of benefits for everyone, provides a predictable framework for the fishing season. You don't have to operate on kind of this crisis management track where every year there's a lot of debate and turmoil and economic instability. And we already know that with climate change, there's even more introduced uncertainty. And so having plans for these fisheries that involve how we're going to monitor, how we're going to define what healthy means and what cautious and critical means, and having those harvest control rules at every level is essential for fisheries management. And there's good examples in Canada, in across the oceans, but you know, that urgency to create a fulsome plan and to get these things implemented is really lacking. So we've seen that implementation gap year after year. You mentioned the fishery audit. We've been tracking that. We're very detailed monitoring on the lack of progress. But like I said, there's really an opportunity here with a modernized Fisheries Act requiring rebuilding plans, requiring the minister to manage fisheries to sustainable, healthy levels, and even more, you know, commitments to climate change and ecosystem approaches. That we have all the tools in the toolbox to be doing this right now.
Yeah, especially when you've mentioned a couple of times the Fisheries Act. You know, we've had a modernized Fisheries Act. It was gutted back in 2016, I think, 2015, 2016, or even before that. Sorry, before that, it was gutted and it changed. And then when this government got back into power, they modernized it. They made it even, you'd almost say they'd made it a little bit more detailed than it was previously before it got changed initially. And it's, you know, like you said, they have the tools there and now they're just not using it. When you prompt the government to be like, why aren't we using these tools? Like, from an Oceana Canada and an NGO perspective, what's their response when they talk about this?
There is a lack of leadership to really provide that clear direction across departments, and that urgency to get things done. So, you know, we're very familiar with a lot of folks that work into the department at various levels, and there's a lot of commitment there to advance this work. So it's really about having a concerted effort and building on success. So, like I said, it was a step forward for this cod and capelin connection to be explicitly addressed. And now it's about making a decision for the ecosystem, using this information to make ecosystem-based fisheries management decisions. And, the world always looks to the collapse of cod as one of the greatest failures of fisheries management. But this can really serve as an opportunity to change the narrative towards maybe one of the first successful examples of ecosystem-based management.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think it'd be really nice to see us work, over the years to implement these tools and to be able to actually put them into place. Hopefully that leadership will come into place sometime soon. And as you mentioned, they're starting to a little bit, and we're starting to see these tools being implemented. So hopefully that'll be great. And I know we kind of crap on some of the management that's been done in the past, but it's nice to see that there are better tools available and that we're starting to see the emergence of sort of tying two fisheries together, because they are so tightly wound up together, and they definitely influence each other in the ecosystem. So that's always great to see.
Yeah, we're
just going back to the.
Oh, I was just going to jump in and say we're this is the time right now, by the way. Like, this is the major fishing season that I'm talking about. We've had these discussions, right. We've given our recommendations, and the decisions are coming down the line in a matter of weeks and months on cod, on capelin, on a lot of the other important fish stocks in especially Atlantic Canada. We've got redfish, mackerel, and federal commitment to deliver rebuilding plans. And so we'll be really looking closely to see if the leadership in the department is able to deliver on their commitments.
Nice. All right. That'll be nice. Now, obviously you guys have done everything you can at this point, and you're waiting for the decisions. What can Canadians do? And even people who are listening to this podcast who aren't Canadian, what can they do to help with like pushing that decision over to what we want?
Yeah, anyone can help raise the importance of fisheries management and protecting our ocean. There's a number of resources to learn about, to share, to talk to your community about, and to communicate that to decision makers. We have public petitions to support our efforts. But you're welcome to write the minister yourself on what you expect her to fulfill her mandate and to deliver on these commitments. I really encourage anyone who is passionate about ocean conservation to really use their voice, as you encourage on this podcast.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I feel like this is a time where we can come in, Oceana Canada and other organizations and various stakeholder groups have put in the time and effort to get this done, but you can't do it by yourself, right? And I feel like this is something that Canadians and people who are just, worried about fisheries in general, the fisheries don't really have political boundaries, and so the effect of Northern Cod and Capelin, as well as sort of the management tools that are put into place, if we can show that there's a success here with, the devastation that we faced back in the 90s, if we can show that this can be recouped and faster, then other countries might use the same sort of tactics and adapt them to their situation. So I think it's really important that we participate in this. And so we'll link to the Oceana Canada website where you can find more information on this, because I think it's really important. I just want to talk a little bit more about the meetings. How long was that first meeting where sort of the science was discussed? Is that like a full day meeting? Is that like a 2 or 3 day meeting? Because for originally when you mentioned it, I was like, oh, maybe it's just like a morning meeting and then you go to the stakeholder meeting, but it can't be that short. I feel like it's going to be a fairly long process, right?
Yeah, I was in St. John's, Newfoundland for 10 days. The assessment meeting was 4 full days. Like I said, one of the most data rich stocks out there. So there's a lot of
right.
information to go through. This model using more information than the last. And so there was new stuff to go over as well. So that was 4 full days. And then the advisory meeting is 1 day.
Gotcha. Now in the 4-day meeting, the science meeting, you get a lot of data, a lot of presentations, a lot of people doing work on it from probably academic institutions, nonprofit organizations, governments, and so forth. How is sort of like I'm assuming it's like, it's based like a critical science review, as you mentioned, it's peer reviewed. So how long, like after a presentation or something, like how long are the question periods? Like, does it go back and forth quite a bit? In this situation, I assume people have been working, some of the people who are working on this have been working on this for decades. And so is it strictly like just sort of data driven and science based, or do people kind of get, a little frustrated with lack of effort, or lack of data, or maybe even not use of data? Like, how does it go within those meetings? They're pretty cordial in there, or can it get a little heated at times, or even just emotional or frustrated at times?
Yeah, well, I think you're supposed to come to these meetings kind of without wearing that hat of who you're representing. So I show up to those meetings as a scientist, and leave my biases at the door and try and be as objective as possible. And there's terms of references for the manner of which we're supposed to conduct ourselves in these meetings, and they're quite well run with a structured agenda. And so there's presentations, there's discussion periods, and then we revisit some of those key discussions at the end, in order to form our consensus on the science advice that goes to managers. So there's a document drafted, and it's supposed to go right to the fisheries manager. And in the Newfoundland region, they're actually one of the regions piloting a new assessment document that is going to be more clear and more timely than we've had in the past. That's something in the fishery audit that we've measured, kind of the timeliness of when these meetings happen and then when the publications come out, and it can be upwards of 2 to 3 years where, okay, this advice is not as timely as it needs to be.
Yeah. Things may have changed a lot at that point too, right? Yeah.
Yeah. And so also, in this new format, centering climate change considerations and ecosystem considerations is something new. And something good.
Yeah, good. Well, it's good to hear. And then the other meeting, where it's the sort of a stakeholder advisory meeting, that's a 1-day meeting, and I assume everybody who's at the meeting gets their say. And are there presentations as well in that kind of meeting? Or is it still data driven, or how's that work?
Yeah, there's a summary of the science, and then presentations on the management measures of the past season, and proposals for the new season. And then it's more of a time for more lengthy discussions and sharing perspectives from stakeholders. So that's all on the record for managers to take into consideration.
Yeah. And those are very important meetings too, right? Because you get, everybody gets their say, and it could be a lot of different opinions and different ways that they think it needs to go, like directions of where the fisheries needs to go. And I think that can always be an interesting meeting to sit in, to see the different perspectives. Traditionally, obviously fisheries stakeholders want to fish more, and they want to be able to go. Can you talk a little bit about sort of what the fisheries union wants? I know there was a press release, and it talked a little bit about the article. Can you just kind of talk just sort of what they asked for?
Yeah, so with cod and capelin, there is a lot of discussion to increase harvests, and some by more than double current amounts. And so there's a lot of varying views on what the management will entail in this upcoming season. And so kind of really a lot of uncertainty of what decision is going to come down the line, given the latest science information and given kind of the varying perspectives. There was, by no means kind of consensus on the measures for this year.
Yeah. And especially when you start to say that, look, there's a potential that this stock is going to dwindle, or it's going to decrease from what it is. They're obviously, they're asking to fish more. That's obviously going to be contentious when everybody does it. It's the economics of the area. That's the way the fishery has gone in the past. But the science usually speaks for itself, and you just got to be realistic about it. And if people want to fish for a long time and still have a sustainable fishery, then that's sometimes it's just the compromise is not going the way people want. That could be on either side or any side of the coin, in this respect.
Yeah, and like I mentioned, despite really good information as to where the stock is and if it's at a healthy level, which it's not, there is a lack of related management measures. So there isn't harvest control rules. So anyone can propose anything if they can justify it. And so really, history has clearly shown that increasing fishing pressure on a stock before it's showing that it's growing well, can really thwart recovery and lead to long-lasting impacts for the fishing community and for the ecosystem.
So just to kind of summarize what we've talked about today, the cod fishery and the capelin fishery are not doing very well. The growth is kind of stalled, and we're looking at trending downward over the next year or so. And then there's still implementation of measures that were brought forth in the new Fisheries Act in 2019 to bring them in now, and they're starting to be implemented slowly. Hopefully they'll be implemented after this report, the science consensus report, will be put in place or written and published. And those will be the management for sort of this year's fishery, right? And when does that fishery begin?
Usually
for this season?
Yeah, usually the decision comes down in May, and capelin possibly in June. But it can be made as early as that, as the minister is given the recommendations for managers, right? And to my knowledge, that information is there now. So giving the most timely decisions allows the fishing industry to respond and prepare to fish or to interact and fish on other stocks.
And so if our call to action today, if people want to contact their minister or their member of parliament and the federal government, we're looking at, be cautious. We know that this fishery is not doing well. Be cautious. Let's not try and increase any kind of fishery. Let's start implementing management tools that are ecosystem based and that are good for the fishery for its long sustaining health. Did I miss anything, or that's pretty much what you mentioned?
Yeah, and I would like to draw to the bigger picture, which is there are only 30 stocks that are currently included in the Fisheries Act. Cod is one of them. Capelin is not. And so we need more fish stocks, all the federally managed fish stocks, to fall within this Fisheries Act. And that will then require that rebuilding plan trigger to be in place. So if these stocks fall within the critical zone, they get rebuilding plans. So that's what we want to see.
Okay, great. And I'll also link to the last year's fisheries audit, which is the most recent fisheries audit, so that people can just sort of get an idea of where those 30 fisheries are managed and what their levels are at. Because I think it's such a great opportunity to read about it. It's very easy to read. It's very visual, and you guys have done a fantastic job as usual in creating those. So Rebecca, thank you so much for coming on the podcast and volunteering your time to be with us and give us all the details of the Northern Cod stocks and capelin and the meeting that went on and what we need to do. We really appreciate it. Love to have you back on to talk about other fishery stocks and important management decisions that need to be done. And thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Rebecca, for joining us on today's episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. It was great to have you on. It was great to get the details of what happens at these meetings. Even for myself as a Canadian marine biologist who doesn't really get to sit in on those meetings or get to know about those meetings very often. I usually just read the reports after in an article. So it was great to be able to get those details. I've invited Rebecca on. We spoke after the recording to come back on a fairly semi-regular basis when she has updates on other fishery stocks and even these ones to be able to give us some information on how they're going and how these management plans are being put in place and when they're going to be put in place and the hopes and the good and the bad of all the way our fishery stocks are managed. Now, I mentioned in the episode, I'm going to link to the Oceana Canada's Fisheries audit, which is a great audit for anybody to read. Very visual, very easy to assess each of the 30 federally managed species. And just to be able to give you some of that history. And of course, a call to action will be placed. I'm going to put a link to the Oceana Canada's website where they talk about fisheries stock assessments and what's needed for better management for Northern Cod and Capelin, and where you can go to do your call to action and contact the member of parliament that is in charge, or if your area, or if you're out of Canada, you want to speak to somebody. the Ministry of Fisheries and Oceans, and others. So thank you so much to Rebecca for joining us on today's episode. And we appreciate Oceana Canada's help in the work that they do, as well as other organizations in the work that they do to ensure that fishery stock assessments are done properly and the management plans are implemented for the future. And I want to thank you for joining us on today's episode, for listening to this episode. I'd love to hear your feedback, or if you have any questions or comments, love to hear you. Why don't you just give me a shout on Instagram. DM me at How to Protect the Ocean. If you want to find out more information about ocean and get news updates and get job ad updates, if you're looking to do a career, you can sign up for our newsletter. That's speakupforblue.com/newsletter. That's speakupforblue.com/newsletter. Monday to Friday, I send out an email and you get it right in your inbox, 8 o'clock in the morning Eastern. So it's people like it because a lot of the news that gets shared in that newsletter don't necessarily hit their regular algorithm or regular news cycle until later. So you get it right as soon as I hear from it, and you get updates on the podcast when it's published and what we're publishing, as well as our other podcasts within the network. So speakupforblue.com/newsletter. Thank you so much for joining us on this episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Lewin. Have a great day. We'll talk to you next time, and happy conservation.